In the last few lectures, we've talked about the Gilded Age, which is a term that was coined actually in the form of the title of a novel co-written by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in 1873. And in talking about that Gilded Age, we looked a lot at the Second Industrial Revolution, especially the Transcontinental Railroad and the effects that that had on the country and on the West, particularly the effects that it had on the growth and development of the cattle industry and cattle drives and so forth. We also talked about the fact that one of the elements of the Gilded Age, in addition to industrialization and economics and urbanization and immigration, was also the growth of the labor movement, and didn't talk a whole lot about that. Did mention that in many ways you could say it started with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. We looked also at the different eras around the Gilded Age and how one led into the other. You know, the Civil War leading into Reconstruction, the Gilded Age beginning a little over halfway into the Reconstruction period. The fact that the latter part of the Gilded Age was also the era of the populist movement, which sort of prepared the way for the progressive era that started at the end of the Gilded Age. And the progressive era was typified, perhaps more than anybody else, by Teddy Roosevelt. But we kind of got, into a lot of detail, particularly about the cattle drives and the cattle industry and the life of the cowboy, and a good bit about land policy relating to cattle and stuff. Because after all, this is the West that we're talking about. But we're now going to return our attention to the broader topic of the Gilded Age and go into a little more detail about the economic and political situation during that time. Now, remember that famous quote from the novel by Mark Twain, in which it was stated that the overall goal was to get rich dishonestly if you can, honestly if you must. Of course, you must realize that was satire. That was Twain's sarcastic take
During
on
the
it.
Gilded Age,
But it was
huge
also a
fortunes were
reflection of
made.
the way a lot of people were thinking
People
at
rose
the time.
uh,
To the top of the financial heap, some very famous names that echo into the 21st century, such as Scottish immigrant Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.D. Rockefeller, John Jacob Astor, J.P. Morgan. John Jacob Astor, by the way, was the great grandson of John Jacob Astor the First. This is John Jacob Astor the Fourth. John Jacob Astor the First, who died in 1848, was America's first multimillionaire. I think he was estimated to be worth, well, tens of millions of dollars. He made his money in the fur trade at the very top of it. Some people referred to folks like this as captains of industry. Now, Astor was not a captain, but he did go to sea on the Titanic in 1912. So sometimes your money doesn't help you. Like I said, though, some call them captains of industry. Others call them robber barons, which originated with this political cartoon from 1889 that in the inset picture in the upper left shows medieval barons accepting demanded tribute from their peasants, and it is comparing that situation to the modern day barons on the right with their flag of war, tariff, and monopoly, You can see that they also have these sashes that say trust, which does not mean, hey, trust me. Trust is another word for monopoly. You can see that the working class and middle class people are handing over their tributes to them in the form of taxes and wages. And the one guy who's clearly a farmer, his tribute is interest on mortgaged farm. Note also that in the cartoon, the robber barons are wielding swords, and the swords say legislation. In other words, the power that they wield that enables them to demand and collect this tribute from their peasants is the power of the law. In fact, political corruption was also a major feature of the Gilded Age. And a lot of that corruption was connected to political machines, by which I don't mean voting machines. Machine is a figure of speech here. Political machines were political party structures in major cities that controlled everything in the city and oftentimes in other areas outside that city. And the politicians who were involved in running that figurative machine ran it on money, a lot of money changing hands, a lot of money flowing upwards into the hands of the people in charge. And one of well, not one of the best example of this is the New Yorker William Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, the boss of Tammany Hall and the Tammany Hall Gang, which sounds like a group of bank robbers, but actually Tammany Hall is essentially the city hall there. It was in New York. So, in other words, ran the political structure of New York and got a piece of the action for everything that was done in the city, essentially. So, everything from building contractors to shipping to whatever might be happening in the city. In order to get the permits, in order to be able to operate, they had to pay money to the politicians. Therefore, the more money that you had to pay the politicians, the more leeway you would have and the more power you could accrue. For Boss Tweed, that all came to an end when he was convicted in 1873 of fraud and corruption and sent to prison briefly and let right back out. But then I think he violated his parole, went back to prison again. Um, Actually, there were all kinds of scandals like that during the era. The Credit Mobilier scandal was another big one. That's one that actually involves the Transcontinental Railroad. Turns out that the owners of the railroads, who were among those robber barons, they were getting leeways and getting lands for the railroad, getting tax breaks, getting contracts from the government to build this railroad, and doing so by greasing the palms of members of Congress, either directly with money or with shares of their railroad companies. That was another huge scandal. A lot of times, money, well, money talks, right? Money controlled the politics and how things ran. This is illustrated in this other political cartoon from the era where you've got a party boss handing things out to what clearly are very wealthy people. What is he handing out? He's handing out special privilege. He's handing out a franchise. Over in his other hand, he's handing out immunity from arrest to these wealthy individuals. In other words, a get out of jail free card. which can be kept until needed or could be sold. Just recently, by the way, I was watching an old episode of Gunsmoke from season 9, 1964. Marshall Dillon's reading the newspaper and reads that Boss Tweed has been released from prison after just a very short time. And he's complaining about it, saying, you know, basically, what's the world coming to? To his friend, the blacksmith Quint Asper, played there by Burt Reynolds on the right, who responds, well, I guess theft doesn't mean the same thing back east that it does here. By the way, I realize it could be argued that the people with money have always run things, even in the United States, and that's probably true. However, it was more true and certainly more blatantly, obviously true in the Gilded Age than at any other time in U.S. history. And to demonstrate just how true it is that the people with the money were the ones making the decisions and running things, I like to do a little experiment in class at this point. I like to ask students, how many presidents can you name between U.S. Grant, who left office in 1877, and Teddy Roosevelt, who took office in 1901? So we're talking about 7 presidents. How many of them could you name? Stop and think for a second. Well, usually when I ask that of my students, we haven't talked about any of those presidents yet at this point, and it's rare that they can come up with more than 1 or 2. And I would say that the average American on the street would probably be in about the same boat. It's kind of hard to name those presidents. And there they are in all their glory. I know you're probably smacking your head right now going, James Garfield, duh, what was I thinking? And maybe you are thinking that. Maybe you could rattle them all off. But most people couldn't, because those presidents, that particular string of presidents, don't really stand out a whole lot. They're not really that exciting to talk about because for the most part, they didn't do anything to stand out. And that's in part because the entire political operation during the time, during the era that most of these men were in office, that all these men were in office, essentially was being run from behind the scenes. To put it into context, let's take a look at some numbers from 1890. Now, in that year, the top 1% wealthiest Americans controlled 50.7% of all the wealth in the United States. So just a little bit over half controlled by that 1%. Then the next level, we'll call them the very well-to-do. That's the next 11% down from the top 1%, controlled 35.3% of the wealth. That takes us up to 86% so far. The middle class, that is the 44% of Americans, kind of right there in the middle, only controlled 12.6%. And the poor, the bottom 44% of Americans, so that's not just the homeless, indigent poor, that's the working poor, only controlled 1.2% of the wealth in the entire country. So you can see it's very much rising to the top. For a little bit of further context, today in 2024, the top 1% in the United States control 30.6% of the country's wealth, so significantly less than in the Gilded Age. However, if you kind of track things backwards, 10 years ago, the top 1% controlled of the country's wealth. Now it's up to over 30. 50 years ago, in the early 70s, it was 9%. So this is why part of why some historians, many historians, say that the United States is actually has entered into a second Gilded Age, the new Gilded Age. Now, is that going to hold true? I guess we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. In the 1870s and 1880s, outlaw gangs, Wild West outlaws like Jesse James, were romanticized and to some extent celebrated, particularly by a lot of farmers in the American West and Midwest. And some people make the claim that that's because of residual feelings about the Civil War and because of pro-Confederate sympathies, Jesse James in particular being a former Confederate. But the fact is that was as much true in Kansas and Nebraska as it was in Missouri and Texas. It was something other than which side you had been on in the Civil War that dictated how a lot of farmers and settlers felt about Jesse James and others. What it comes down to is what did Jesse James do for a living? Well, you know what he did for a living. He robbed banks and he robbed trains. And farmers hated bankers and railroad executives. Sort of to add credence to that theory, consider that there is another time period in American history when a lot of folks in America, especially in the Midwest and the West, once again romanticized bank robbers. What time period are we talking about? We're talking about the Great Depression, when various bank robbers achieved considerable heights of notoriety, and some of them, like Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, also having this Robin Hood quality that had previously been incorrectly ascribed to Jesse James to them, because a lot of working class Americans, especially farmers in the Midwest, once again didn't like banks very much. By the way, in the 2020s, I have found that students are often surprised to learn that Machine Gun Kelly and Babyface are not just 21st century music celebrities. But then again, 10 years ago, a lot of students would express surprise to learn that Jesse James was not just a reality show motorcycle mechanic. That seems to have passed. Anyhow, once again, I digress. Anyhow, in addition to farmers being upset at banks and railroads, a lot of workers, particularly urban factory workers, as well as railroad workers around the country, coal miners, other kinds of miners, were upset about low wages, which were sort of unstable. Your salary. We're used to having a salary, and then either you get a raise or you don't. But during that time, your salary might be decreased sometimes two or three times in a year. So workers were upset about that. They were upset about child labor, which was pretty common in factories and mines because those little kids can get into tight spaces, and also because you don't have to pay them as much, which not only endangers people's kids, but it also puts their dads out of work. Also, there was concern about convict labor, where county jails and state prisons would essentially rent out their prisoners to farmers or mine owners or even factories to do the labor for just a fraction of what they would have to pay a free working person. And then the money, of course, went to the county or the state. So that's putting workers out of work. They were agitating for other things like an 8-hour workday as opposed to a 13, 14-hour workday, and various other things. Safety conditions. Safety conditions was a big concern. Factories were extraordinarily dangerous. Perhaps you've heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York that killed a lot of women who were working there because they couldn't get out of the building. Um, a lot of times there were accidents in coal mines, particularly fires and explosions, and a lot of times those safety issues could have been corrected, but if they were corrected, it would have affected the company's bottom line. So a lot of these business owners sort of made the calculation that it's cheaper to hire new workers when the ones you've got get maimed or killed rather than to spend the money to make it safer. So that was a huge concern. That's also part of the reason that, as the old saying goes, the rich kept getting richer and the poor kept getting poorer, but the poor also were getting pretty ticked off about it. And that's why, as I think I mentioned briefly in a previous lecture, there is a connection between the Gilded Age and the game of Monopoly, which is based on a game designed by Elizabeth Magee back in 1902, 1903, called the Landlord's Game, very similar to Monopoly as we now know it, that she designed to be, quote, a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing with all its usual outcomes and consequences, end quote. In other words, to demonstrate how unfair and unjust the economic system was. She was very much a progressive. And the game slowly took off. A lot of college students wound up playing it. Quakers apparently played this game a lot, and it was also used in colleges by professors to demonstrate how a capitalist economy works. Then in 1935, right smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression, Parker Brothers released the game Monopoly, that pretty much on its release is about what it still is now. Essentially a reworking, really, of the Landlord's game. And from the very beginning, it had that guy waving his money around. Notice how important trades are in Monopoly. If you've ever played it, it's a very aggressive game, kind of hard to win, and it's not a coincidence that it made a huge comeback during the Depression. Remember, we talked earlier about the bank robbing connection between the Gilded Age and the Depression, all just kind of centered on average people's frustration with how the economic situation was going. By 1940, this character was introduced as a mascot, Rich Uncle Pennybags, who officially was named Milburn Moneybags. By the way, Parker Brothers renamed him in 1999 as Mr. Monopoly. And here you can see the current incarnation, or a recent incarnation of the game that you're probably all familiar with. Anyway, they were hoping Mr. Monopoly would stick because it sounds a whole lot less crass and perhaps less sarcastic than Rich Uncle Pennybags. But it all ties back. It all ties back to the frustration of average Americans during the Gilded Age with robber barons. Now, of course, the goal of Monopoly is to be the robber baron, right? I mentioned college professors using the landlord's game. When I was in college, my sociology professor had us play um, coal mining town Monopoly, in which we used a basic, a Monopoly game. But one person in the class was designated to be the coal mine owner, and everybody else were the workers. And the way the game worked was that the coal mine owner got $200 every time he passed go, and everyone else each got $20 when they passed go. So you don't have to be a genius to figure out from the very beginning, before the first move is made, who is set up to win in that situation. But while a lot of working class Americans were upset about the economic situation in the Gilded Age, a lot of robber barons and aspiring robber barons and friends of robber barons had a different take on it all. One of those takes is expressed in an analogy from the time that is called the horse and sparrow analogy. And this is explaining why the economic system worked. That is, it's a defense of that system at the time. And essentially, in this example, you're being told that if you got a horse and you also have a bunch of sparrows, maybe that you're fond of having around, it's a waste of time and energy and resources to feed the sparrows. Don't be throwing seed to the sparrows. Instead, feed it to the horse, and then your horse is going to get all the energy that he needs to do all the dynamic stuff that horses do, and then some of that seed he's going to poop out. It's going to be in his manure, and the sparrows can just pick through it and find what they need, and they'll be fine. Well, if you're the sparrow in that analogy, or the person or people that those sparrows represent, maybe you don't appreciate that as much. But it's being offered as a practical explanation. Another explanation that became very popular was called social Darwinism, which is a reflection of the popularity by that time, or at least the widely known quality of the principles of Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, and the idea that evolution, the survival of the fittest, improves the species, right? Because it weeds out the individuals in a species that cannot advance that species, weeds out the weak links, and only the strong survive. And in social Darwinism, that's being applied to a social context, and essentially is saying that if you've got some people that are extraordinarily wealthy, well, good, because that is a demonstration that they are the fittest. Else they wouldn't have all that money. They wouldn't have had so much success. They are the fittest, and the weak ones are being weeded out that way, and that's good from the perspective of this explanation, because it's going to make the whole system better in the long run. Well, again, as you can imagine, those on the bottom in the system might not have appreciated that analogy quite as much as the ones on top. But what it did do is it enabled those who were at the very top to feel a sense of security, a sense of perhaps purpose, a sense of validation. Hey, yes, we're wildly wealthy, but we earned it, and it shows how great we are. And there also started to be this idea that those people at the very top, why they use some of that money to pay for public works, to pay for important things that benefit the entire public. And, the names Vanderbilt and Rockefeller were slapped all over the place, things that they donated money to. And that benefits the little people. It's a little bit of the old horse and sparrow thing there. And enabled those, again, at the very top, that 1%, the robber baron class, to feel a little satisfied and to feel a little bit even justified in being where they were. But you might justifiably be asking yourself, what does all this have to do with the West? Isn't all this more about the country in general? Well, let's look specifically at the West here, starting with this map of all the railroads that were in existence by 1890. As you can see, there's quite a few railroads now in the West, a lot of connections, especially if you look there in Kansas. And it is railroad workers who are among the workers who are dissatisfied and frustrated. Let's look also at some of the mining operations in the West because miners were also dissatisfied. Let's take coal, for example. As you'll notice, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of coal available in Appalachia, also a good bit in the Midwest, some in Texas. But notice how much coal of a variety of different types is available in the West. So coal mining was a big thing and still is. And of course, gold and silver mines loom large in the imagination of the Old West. Here's where those were located, as well as the location of some of the major mining towns that sprang up sometimes overnight as people flowed in to try to make their fortunes. Although by the late Gilded Age period, a lot of these mining operations in gold and silver even were controlled by companies, and by this time, often corporations that hired workers to do the actual labor. And thank you to National Geographic for producing this map that ties together several of the things that we've been talking about for the past few hours. You've got the major cattle trails, you've got the major railroads, you've got the location of gold and silver country, and you've also got the locations of the major mining towns, major and also most famous, like Tombstone and Deadwood and Leadville and Virginia City. And here's a map that shows the location of mining operations present day that include various metals that are not as flashy as gold and silver, no pun intended, but there are a lot of them: copper, lead, zinc, and so forth. And look how many are out there in the West, not far from those coal areas that we looked at earlier. So, it's not something that can be as romanticized, a lead mine, but there were some, and towns built up around them as well. And sometimes when those mines, whether it was gold or whether it was copper or zinc, when those mines would play out, you'd be left with something that is also closely associated with the Old West, the ghost town, which more often than not became a ghost town because of mining operations ceasing in the area, because sometimes it was all mined up. There were some ghost towns that resulted for other reasons, but that was the cause of most of them. There were several significant labor strikes among the mining communities in the West. The first one that we're going to look at happened in 1892 up in Idaho in Coeur d'Alene, which, if you speak French and you see that, you know that in French it's pronounced Coeur d'Alene. That's actually the name of a Native American tribe in the area named by the French. So that's where that name comes from. Anyhow, there in Coeur d'Alene, the silver mines in 1892 increased the required work hours for their miners, and then lowered their wages at the same time. So more work, less money, which did not make the miners happy. There was talk of a strike, and then they discovered, the miners, that there was a spy in their midst, a guy named Charlie Siringo, who was an agent for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Now, it was pretty common for mine owners in the West and elsewhere to hire private security, to hire even detectives to infiltrate unions. And Pinkerton was a company that was frequently used for that. Baldwin Felts was another big one. Both those companies headquartered in Chicago. Siringo had started out as a cowboy, and he had been present in Chicago during the Haymarket affair, and as a result of that, decided to join the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And he actually got a reference from Sheriff Pat Garrett, if you're familiar with the story of Billy the Kid, and became a Pinkerton detective, also sometimes a bounty hunter on the side, sometimes he was referred to as a range detective or cattle detective because part of what he did was tracking down rustlers. Pinkertons also were hired by the railroad agencies to track down train robbers. In fact, Pinkertons were a thorn in the side of Jesse James and his gang. Anyhow, Siringo had written his autobiography, and it was pretty successful in the 1880s. Maybe if you write your autobiography, it might cut in on your efforts to work undercover. I don't know. Anyhow, he was discovered and barely escaped with his life. And this led to a huge strike, a huge conflict between the miners and the private security forces by the mine owners, resulted in U.S. troops being called in, which is a fairly common thing during these strikes regarding mines in the West and also elsewhere. And finally, that got resolved. And by resolved, I mean that the Idaho National Guard came in and arrested hundreds of miners, and the whole region was under military control for several months. Now, not too long after that, in neighboring Montana, several of those same miners who had been involved in this, I'm talking about maybe a year later, in Butte, with other miners, formed the Western Miners Federation, which was an official union, and it's going to be a very well organized union that kind of directly came out as a result of the events there at Coeur d'Alene. Also in 1893, the country spiraled into a huge economic downturn known as the Panic of 1893 that caused silver prices to spiral. Gold, however, the value of gold, price of gold remained fixed. The United States was on the gold standard at that time, which means that any money that's issued is based on the amount of gold that the U.S. holds in the Treasury. Bear that in mind. It may not seem like it has anything to do with the events at hand, but we'll get to it. Okay, now in 1894, in Cripple Creek, the mining operations there, gold and silver mining operations, affected particularly by that silver prices going down, led to the mine owners doing the same thing that had happened 2 years ago in Idaho, which is that they demanded longer working hours but lowered the wages of the workers. And so something similar happened. There was a strike. There was violence between the striking workers and strike breakers called in by the mine owners. Something significant about Cripple Creek, something that very, very rarely happened in that time period. In fact, it may not have happened anywhere else. Is the militia was called in support of the miners, not the owners. So that's something that's a little bit different. The miners, by the way, among other things, were calling for the U.S. to get off of the gold standard. And that's going to tie into the populist movement that we're going to talk about soon. Okay, well, that was the Gilded Age era. The Progressive Age started, depending on how you define it, late 1890s to 1900 or as late as 1901, followed by the Progressive era. Okay, now in the Progressive era, that 20-year span, there was a lot more going on, labor-wise and mining-wise in the American West. There was the Colorado Mining Wars in 1903 and 1904. Very violent confrontations between striking miners and Pinkerton detectives, as usual. Troops were called in. Then later in Ludlow, Colorado, around 1912, 1913, there was a strike there of coal miners, and they were living in a tent city because coal mining towns, the mine owners owned all the housing. So if you went on strike, you got kicked out of your house. This particular incident in Ludlow, the National Guard was called in, and they had machine guns, and they used these new things just invented called tanks to roll into that tent city, open fire on the miners. A bunch of people got killed. This was a huge, huge scandal. Then in 1917, up in Butte, Montana, where the Western Miners Federation had been formed, a very prominent labor organizer named Frank Little, representing the international workers of the world, was up there in support of a copper miners strike, and he was abducted and lynched there from a telegraph pole, I believe, in Butte, Montana. A note pinned on him saying "First and Last Warning." So that also was a huge scandal. All this together gives you an idea of the labor unrest that was affecting the whole country, but was also specifically and especially in mines affecting the West. Going back to the actual Gilded Age era, though, take a look at this map that shows counties reporting a strike of any kind between 1870 and 1900. So that covers your whole Gilded Age. And as you can see, quite a few of them were in the mountainous western mining country. Now, here's something else that's interesting. If you take a look at the areas of the country as of 1880 that had foreign-born citizens, that is the biggest concentration of foreign-born U.S. citizens, you'll see that a lot of them are in the West. The Great Lakes region and the West. Now, the ones along the U.S.-Mexico border could well be people who were born in Mexico and were now living in the U.S., but that really couldn't explain the rest of them. A lot of the immigration coming to the West, as we discussed earlier, was from outside even the Western Hemisphere, and a lot of them wind up also being in unions, and a lot of the anti-union sentiment that is stirred up around the country is tied in to anti-immigrant sentiment, so that eventually labor, immigration, and socialism and anarchism are all sort of tied together in the minds of a lot of Americans, fairly or unfairly. And yet the labor movement kept growing as the Gilded Age moved on. More and more unions were formed. Here is a very significant one, the Knights of Labor, that was formed in 1869. Had a little bit of a slow start, but really picked up speed in the late 1870s. And by about 1886, 20% of all American workers were members of the Knights of Labor, which that is very significant. This was an across-the-board union, which covered all professions. As the 1880s drew to a close and there was more pressure brought to bear on the labor movement, The Knights of Labor started to kind of falter, and then it also wound up being fragmented in the 1890s as more and more people broke away from it to form more specific unions to their particular profession, kind of like the Western Miners Federation that we talked about earlier. So that's what's going on with miners specifically, and laborers in industry more broadly. What about farmers? Well, farmers were having a rough time during the Gilded Age, too. We've talked quite a bit about farmers' issues with the railroad companies, with the high rates they were being charged for shipping and storage, but there were other issues. There was a price glut on cotton, which affected the South a whole lot, but there's a lot of cotton grown in Texas and Oklahoma as well. There were high interest rates, high tariffs. We talked about that panic in 1893 that drove down silver prices, but we've talked before about the Panic of 1873, which did the same thing. So these are two huge financial panics that left farmers really in the lurch. So, what's a farmer to do? The mine workers and the factory workers joined together in unions. Well, farmers started to form their own organizations as well. And this was the first one, established around the same time as the Knights of Labor, a couple of years earlier, actually in 1867. The National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, or just the Grange, or sometimes the National Grange. Members referred to as Grangers. This was the very first national agricultural advocacy group in the United States. And they gradually grew more and more prominent and had more and more influence over the next couple of decades. They particularly sought to influence politicians to pass laws that would benefit farmers, particularly the regulation of railroads and control of the prices that railroads could charge farmers. The Grange had chapters all over the country, but they were particularly powerful and especially influential in the Midwest, and they're still around. They are still here today, not as big as they once were, but still here. Then, coming along behind the Grangers, was the Farmers Alliance, which became extremely popular around the country in the Gilded Age era, starting in the 1870s with chapters and branches all over the country. The Farmers Alliance was a co-op. It was a cooperative financing and marketing operation for the benefit of farmers, and even more so, much more so than the Grangers, political activists trying to influence policy and eventually to get at the root of that by influencing who got elected to enact the policy, making sure or trying to make sure that they were pro agriculture. There was even a concerted effort in the 1890s to unite with the Knights of Labor and with railroad workers. That never really quite gelled because those groups had different goals and different needs. For example, labor unions needed the cost of food to go down to benefit workers, but farmers needed the cost of food to go up to benefit farmers. However, that they at least they did make the effort. This is a flag of the Texas branch of the Farmers Alliance. There's the motto of the alliance: the most good for the most people. The Granger's motto was the suffering of one should be the concern of all, so very similar. You see this X here, this axis with four arms, and you see that the arms are wisdom, justice, or wisdom and moderation, rather. Those are the two axes. And then the other things that are important here, the four things, the people, the justice, the alliance, the free trade. So all of these things, very important to farmers' alliances around the country. Eventually, by the early 1890s, members of the Farmers Alliance who got together, the leadership had a big conference in Ocala, Florida, and came up with a list of things they wanted to accomplish, including the 8-hour workday, regulation of railroads, various other things. Came to recognize that they're going to have to be even more directly involved if they want to get the things enacted that they're trying to enact. So therefore, they wound up, along with other groups, joining together to form a new political party, a third party. The People's Party was the official name of it, but it was generally referred to as the Populist Party. And here you can see some flyers advertising Populist Party activities. The Populist Party was essentially the living embodiment of the populist movement or the populist era. So the populist era was a time period at the end of the Gilded Age from roughly the late 1880s to the late 1890s, when the people, hence populism, the average people in the United States started to react against the excesses of the Gilded Age and the robber barons. It's time when you saw a lot of organizing, when you saw a lot of labor organizing, and also a lot of farmers organizing to try to roll back a lot of those excesses and to try to introduce protections for the average person, for the working people of America. The Populist Party itself put forward a presidential candidate in the 1892 election, as well as candidates for several other offices. Their presidential candidate was James Weaver, a former Union general, which kind of hurt them in the South. How did they do overall? Well, they didn't come anywhere close to winning the presidential election, as you can see. However, they did pretty good considering. This is one of the best showings, and quite possibly the best showing ever for a third party in a presidential election. They got over 1 million votes. And, they didn't come anywhere close to winning the number of electoral votes, but they actually got some electoral votes, which third parties very rarely do. And they got several. They got 22, and they actually carried 4 states, Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, and Idaho, and parts of North Dakota and Oregon, which may look a little strange, but that's because back then there were some states that didn't have a winner-take-all, but it was all by congressional district. So, for example, North Dakota had 3 electoral votes and wound up with 1 going to each of the 3 principal parties there. Nonetheless, pretty good showing. And in addition to that, the Populist Party won 3 governorships and produced 15 new members of Congress, all in the West. The West was the heart and soul of the populist movement. Let's take a closer look at those Western states and that presidential election. So here you can see in dark green the 4 states in which the populists actually carried the vote in the presidential election and got more than 50% of the vote. Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, and Idaho. But as you'll see, they also got between 20 and 50% in 7 other states. So a pretty significant domination of the American West, except for California and Montana. So they were doing pretty good. In the 1896 presidential election cycle, they did something different. Coming to the conclusion that they had no chance of winning the presidency by getting enough electoral votes, they decided, even though that they ran candidates for other offices, when it came to president, they threw their support behind one of the two main parties, and it was the Democratic Party, whose nominee was William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska. Now, Bryan was a fiery orator, and he was very, very much against keeping the gold standard. He was in favor of what was called free silver, which the populists also supported. What does that mean? Well, we talked earlier about what the gold standard is. You can't issue paper money unless you have an equal amount of gold in the treasury. They wanted the United States to add silver to the treasury, right? To add silver to what could be backed up by paper money. This would enable more paper money to be introduced into the economy, an infusion of cash, which they believed would benefit farmers and workers. In one of his speeches, Bryan very famously said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Well, that didn't work. Didn't happen for a while. It wasn't until the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration in the 1930s that silver was added and the U.S. went off the gold standard. But that was one of the big things that they were after. Bryan was also, in addition to being kind of leaning toward some populist positions, very, very religious. In fact, you might recognize his name as being one of the volunteer prosecutors, the most famous prosecutor in the Scopes monkey trial or evolution trial in Tennessee, about 25 years after this. He was a strong supporter of what was called the social gospel, which was a big movement in the 1890s and early 1900s that was a reaction against social Darwinism. The social gospel was essentially a lot of very religious-minded people coming to the conclusion that Jesus would like us to try to make life better here on Earth for people. And so they got involved in a lot of social justice issues. He was really big on that. Well, some people call this the first modern election, but some people call practically every 19th century election that. In this case, it's because this is the first time that millions of dollars were spent on campaigns. Well, the Populist Party went all out supporting William Jennings Bryan, which didn't work out for them. Bryan and the Democrats were defeated in the presidential election by the Republican candidate William McKinley, who then became the next president. His running mate, McKinley's running mate, Garrett Hobart of New Jersey, who died in office near the end of McKinley's first term. And when McKinley ran for re-election, he replaced Hobart on the ticket with Teddy Roosevelt. So, populists gambled big, and it did not work out. This was a big blow to them. Big blow to William Jennings Bryan. Didn't keep him from continuing to run for president. He ran multiple times, kind of becoming the Henry Clay of that era. But for the populists, they still kind of limped along for the better part of a decade. But eventually, they just sort of disappeared, and their members joined one of the two other parties, so usually the Democrats at this time. William Jennings Bryan and his anti-gold standard movement, ran for president again in 1900, once again got the Democratic nomination. And that's where we're going to bring in this guy to the discussion, L. Frank Baum, who was born and raised in upstate New York, but who did spend quite a bit of time in the West. When he was a young man, moved out to Dakota Territory, where he and his wife owned and operated a store, and where he published and edited a newspaper. And then for years afterward was in the newspaper business, kind of alternating with the sales business. And in 1890, he wrote some editorials about Wounded Knee and Sitting Bull that we will be talking about probably coming up very soon. But that's 10 years before the time period we're looking at now, 1900. And what he's most famous for, of course, you can see in the photograph, the first royal historian of Oz. What he's most famous for is his children's book that came out in 1900, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So the book was written during the campaign season, probably. Certainly, because it came out the same year that the election later took place. Many people have postulated that Baum, who was known for writing political editorials before this, actually was using this, doing double purpose there with this book. It was a children's book written to entertain children, but some people believe it may also have been an elaborate allegory about the politics of the late 1890s. Now, Baum himself never admitted that that was true, but there's some circumstantial evidence, such as the fact that 2 years after the book came out, there was a Broadway play that he was involved in the writing of that had a lot of references to robber barons and to the president of the United States and so forth. But so far as the book itself, over the years, many scholars have kind of dwelled on the idea that this may have been his statement about what was going on politically. Now, why is that? Well, for it all to make sense, you have to know something about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book. Something that has kind of been lost over time. What were Dorothy's magic slippers given to her by Glinda the Good Witch? What were they made out of? If you answered ruby, that these were the ruby slippers, that's because you haven't read the book and you know the story from the movie that came out in the late 1930s, where they changed that detail. In the book, her shoes were made of silver. However, it was decided that ruby red's a much more striking color, and they filmed those portions of the story in color in the movie, and so they made that change. But bear in mind, originally they're supposed to be silver slippers. So, you know the story. Dorothy Gale of Kansas is blown away by a cyclone and is blown away to this strange magical land where she's told in order to get back home, she has to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City, where the wise Wizard of Oz will be able to get her back home. And it eventually turns out that the silver slippers given to her by the Good Witch are actually the means by which she can get home. The gold yellow brick road led to the wizard, who was a fraud. Along the way, of course, she makes some friends like the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and the Cowardly Lion, and she encounters a wicked witch or two. So that's the story. You all know it. Let's frame this now in the context of a political allegory. All right, so where's Dorothy from? She's from Kansas. the uh, the middle of the country, the area in the where the Midwest meets the West, the area that was kind of the focal point of the populist movement. All right. Dorothy Gale is a farm girl. She's the girl next door. She is representing basically America. Okay. She gets blown away by a cyclone. A cyclone tears through Kansas. This cyclone could be interpreted as the populist movement, a political revolution that stirs everything up and blows her away, carries her away on its winds until she gets to the yellow brick road. I'm sorry, to the land of Oz, where she's told, follow the yellow brick road, yellow or gold. The gold standard's going to get you there, and it's going to get you to the Emerald City, the capital of Oz, which would be Washington. The wizard is in charge in the Emerald City. Who's in charge in Washington? The president, President McKinley, who is very much in favor of the gold standard. It turns out that McKinley is a fraud. That the gold standard and his way of doing things are not going to get America back where it needs to be. The answer was right there all along: silver. Just make use of that silver and you can get back where you belong. In this scenario, her friends and allies would have various meanings. The Tin Man would represent factory workers, and the Scarecrow would represent farmers, who were a big part of the populist movement, as we've discussed. The Tin Man, or the factory workers, turned out to actually have more heart than they thought they did. And the Scarecrow, or the farmers, turn out to have more brains than anybody thought they did. The Cowardly Lion here, it is speculated, is William Jennings Bryan, who is all roar and no bite, who turns and runs as a general habit, who doesn't actually have the natural courage to face down his opponents and be the king of the jungle and be a winner. So a message here is don't believe in William Jennings Bryan either again, unless you take into account the fact that at the end he does find his courage. Now, the Wicked Witches represent the opponents of the populist movement, which is the robber barons, essentially. Wicked Witch of the East would represent industrialists or factory owners, whereas the Wicked Witch of the West would represent mine owners. Now, if that's the case, if the Wicked Witch of the West represents mine owners, what are the flying monkeys that she sends out to do her bidding and destroy the heroes? What do they represent? What could they represent other than the Pinkertons, the strike breakers sent out by the Wicked Witch? Now, is this what L. Frank Baum intended? Was it unconscious? Or is it just an elaborate coincidence, kind of like the fact that, you may have heard this, if you get the Pink Floyd album, The Dark Side of the Moon, and you start it right when the MGM lion roars at the beginning of the movie The Wizard of Oz, and then you watch the movie with the sound turned off to the soundtrack of Dark Side of the Moon, all the songs match up. Pink Floyd did not do that intentionally. It is a giant coincidence, and maybe this is too. It's entirely possible. You can't really say one way or the other. But if you kind of hold this in mind, this has been true in my case, it can help you to remember the very elaborate politics of the late 1890s and the 1900 election in particular.